Welcome to the Second Thought podcast, where we train the crosshairs of reason on the presenters of thought for the day from BBC Radio 4. Today's Second Thought is on what was broadcast by Rabbi Daniel Greenberg on the 22nd of May 2025. Somewhat unusually, this is not a drawn-out complaint about a lack of accuracy in what was claimed by the presenter, or about a lack of logical coherence. There's no complaint that the broadcast was platitudinous guff, like those we've seen from Ibrahim Mogra. It wasn't a thought vacuum, like one notable example recently from Martin Rowe, and it didn't contain deceptive rhetoric, like those from Jennifer Smith. It was not a great example, but it wasn't bad. Daniel made a very lame gesture at topicality, and it most certainly was not a reflection on a person or an event in the news. That topicality nod was no more than the rhythm of the Jewish year as reflected in topics of teaching. It was, though, a reflection on property law from a Jewish perspective, one that has resonance with the temporary stewardship we have of this planet, particularly given how bad we appear to be at it. Daniel opened his thought for the day with these words.
There is no word for mine in the Hebrew language. For any Hebrew speakers now shouting Sheli at the radio, the late Rabbi Maurice Swift, a leading UK Orthodox rabbinic judge of the last century, noted for powerful and idiosyncratic sermons, used to respond to similar cries of Sheli from around the synagogue by explaining that it is a conflation of two words, yesh, meaning there is, and li, meaning to me. This etymological construct reminds us that the Jewish concept of property is that God assigns property to my use and control from time to time, but it remains God's in all real senses.
The main problem, and it is pretty trivial compared to a lot of the ridiculous crap that the BBC allows Thought for the Day to broadcast, that problem was with the linguistic position that Daniel introduced with Maurice Swift. First, what Swift described is not a conflation, but that goes straight to the heart of the periphery. The problem is that what Rabbi Swift claims about Sheli is almost certainly not true. He said that Hebrew does not have a word for mine. Convenient for teaching, poetic even, but nonetheless not true. There are thousands of apparent rules about grammar and usage of language. At least, I'm guessing there are. I have to extrapolate exclusively from English, but I can't imagine the same isn't true outside the Anglophone world. And over the last 40 years, I've been frowned at by teachers and contemporaries and books for many an apparent breach of these rules. For example, splitting an infinitive, and for not splitting an infinitive, for treating the word none as though grammatically it is singular, for using theirs instead of his and hers, and a little more recently for using his or hers instead of theirs. Each of these was presented to me as though I'd committed a grave error. Now, one of them was an error. At least it was by the logic into which I'm now about to delve. 30 years ago, I became interested in knowing why so much of the way we routinely speak and write was considered wrong. That inspired the purchase of my first copy of Fowler's Modern English Usage. Fowler's, I should point out, is about as close as there was and we have to a definitive set of rules for using English, particularly in formal writing. And with a copy of Fowler's in hand, I took to it all rather too well. For at least a decade, I was a card-carrying member of the grammar Gestapo, which was a problem. It gradually became apparent to me that I'd somewhere taken a wrong step. The grammar police seemed much less motivated by clarity of communication than they were by virtue signalling of their elitist knowledge and demonstrating support of a collection of ideas that were not easy to justify. There was also a habit among those usage wardens of being selective with the guidance they were willing to follow, especially when it changed, or that guidance demoted a rule that they had enjoyed following for several decades. There was consequently a righteousness to many defenders of correct English usage, and my experience has been that righteous behaviour tends to reveal a triumph of certainty over curiosity, and realising that I'd become victim to the same triumph was humbling and a little embarrassing. By way of illustration, usage guardians of yore would preach that because the word none was a contraction of the phrase not one, then we should treat none as though it were singular, and not plural. Hence, because it was correct to say that not one of these is green, then we should also say that none of these is green, instead of none of these are green. If, though, you hear someone today say that none of these is green, they are almost certainly in the business of signalling to anyone who knows or cares that they're knowledgeable of this old rule. Oddly, they're also signalling their ignorance, or perhaps that they are stubbornly a creature of habit. It turns out that none is not a contraction of not one. It's derived from an Old English word, none, which was a compound of words that meant not and one, but that had been used as a word in its own right, both singular and plural, for as long as it was in usage. There was no sound argument, and there never had been a sound argument, for none in English to be regarded always as singular. And the same is true with split infinitives. To boldly go is the most famous split infinitive, yet you'll hear an ever-decreasing population of diehards who, outside the context of Star Trek, will say something more like boldly to go instead. These folk, too, are no longer in the business of effective communication of meaning, but instead are in the business of selective communication of elitist virtue. They, too, are wrong, both by the yardsticks of usage and of language. Not splitting infinitives was a 19th century invention based upon an analogy, a ridiculous analogy, with Latin. It's no more logical than saying all instances of the letter C in English should be pronounced the way that K's are pronounced, because that's how they were pronounced in Latin. It's a bewilderingly stupid rule. Most English usage guidance in the 1990s was prescriptive, and this included much of the 1996 copy of Fowler's that I'd purchased, and it included pretty much every similar guide published at that point for all of history. The authors and the editors of these books took a line on what they believed to be correct and the English that they believed people ought to use. Correct English was prescribed by a knowledgeable elite, and very little account was taken by the sources of this guidance on how English was actually used, or that this usage was causing the language to change. By the time of Fowler's 1996 edition, a descriptive approach had started eroding the traditional prescriptive model. By 2010, the descriptive approach to how English should be used had taken over. Description overtook prescription. Curiosity finally overtook dogma. Science overtook judgment. How we speak overtook how that grammar Gestapo thought we should speak. Usage and meaning were finally accepted as being in constant flux. So someone jamming a dictionary into the cycle of change, claiming that a usage had deviated from a preferred definition, is now mostly an illustration that someone missed a meeting. I am no student of Hebrew, but linguistics does appear to operate by a fairly consistent set of rules. Languages change, words change, the spellings change, the meanings change, new words are coined and old words fall into the shadows of the larger dictionaries. It's now clear both from history and linguistics that a word has the meaning we give to it with use, and not the meaning that it once had, or the meanings associated with its etymology. I recall reading a book by the wonderful writer Bill Bryson in the 90s. It set out a concise and accessible guide to English usage. In fact, he wrote 2 books, Troublesome Words and Mother Tongue. Both noble efforts, and I enjoyed reading them very much. Many people, just like me, wanted to know what was right. And if, like him, you'd worked in a busy newsroom, being right really mattered. Well, more importantly, consistency mattered. The editors would want there to be a uniformity of usage and style across all the articles of the newspaper. So newspapers inevitably had style guides, and almost all style guides reinforced many prescriptive elements of English usage. Under the banner of consistently high quality, this is sensible but should not be allowed to conflate with general guidance on usage. Bill Bryson was simply sharing the benefits of his journalistic experience, and books like Bryson's, along with many similar examples, were really useful for anyone at the time wanting to know what was considered correct, in this case, by an experienced print journalist. Reading them today, though, is like watching QI, where a collection of earnestly held myths, misnomers, and untruths are blasted apart by modernity, careful research, and raucous laughter. The example that springs to mind is decimate. Bill Bryson, along with many other careful professional users of English, prescribed that decimate should only be used to denote a reduction by a tenth. Readers were warned by Bryson against using decimate in its modern sense to obliterate, being told that its meaning was imposed by the Latin. Yep, bloody Latin again, wading in. And the Latin meaning meant to reduce by a tenth. It was apparently a Roman military punishment. So you have a military leader needing to send a very serious message to his troops, and he would group his unfortunate men into tens, who would then draw lots. And in each group, 9 would be ordered to kill the loser. Literary sources suggest that this did occur, well, at least once. Possibly. A commander called Marcus Licinius Crassus was reported with a degree of consistency across multiple sources to have used decimation during the Spartan revolt to restore discipline. After that, the threat of decimation was probably sufficient. While it may once have happened, the claimed implications of Latin origins for the modern meaning of the word decimate are hogwash. The word decimate means what we use it to mean. It means obliterate or devastate. Even lofty former broadsheet journalists like Bill Bryson will not be found using the word to mean reduce by 1/10. For a start, no one would have a clue what he meant, defeating the very purpose of writing. It seems likely that decimate has not been used without agenda outside of academia to mean reduce by a tenth for well over 200 years. When the word entered English via French, it already meant to punish 1/10, not kill 1/10. The capital element of punishment had already slipped. The numerical element then in the 1600s began to fade. By the 18th century, outside of Roman History Club, the word was routinely used to mean destroy a large part of or to devastate. There were, of course, holdouts, those who objected to this imprecise use. Preserving nuance was considered important. What, though, did they think they were losing? It is almost never useful to describe a punishment by death of 1 in 10. The word was effectively given new life by a change in usage, with a new and much more useful meaning. It wasn't that the precision of the word was lost. The need for the original meaning was lost, opening the way for what linguists apparently call a semantic broadening. As noted earlier, words change, which is why dictionaries are revised so often. Most major dictionaries now make a PR opportunity each year, announcing the top new words and significant and usually modestly controversial changes in meanings of existing words. And literally, I'm looking at you. Lexicographers, the compilers of our dictionaries, build windows to the past, well aware they cannot provide authority on what is current. Dictionary readers, though, behave differently, as though they've purchased an enduring truth comparable to the words of God. I suspect all of us at some point have consulted a 20-year-old dictionary and relayed what we found there as absolute authority. Before the turn of the millennium, the writers and readers of usage guides took refuge in exactly the same belief of authority. Which brings us back to the powerful and idiosyncratic sermons of the late Rabbi Morris Swift. Well, at least to Swift's insistence that there is no Hebrew word for mine, and his insistence on dismissing the word sheli, explaining that it's merely a compound of two words, yesh, meaning there is, and li, meaning to me. Hebrew, I'm sure, has its linguistic quirks, but, on the face of it, by Swift's logic, there is no English word for football, or everything, or microscope, or today, or greenhouse, or outcome, or telephone, or insight, which is clearly nonsense. Or poppycock, or even codswallop. If etymology matters for meaning, then we are in a world of trouble. The word artificial once meant skillfully made, nice meant ignorant, and decimate meant punish and set a grisly example by randomly killing 10% of your army. Hebrew obviously has a word for mine, regardless of its etymology, and apparently that word is sheli. The unusual and dynamic behaviour of languages is described beautifully in two excellent books I find myself recommending almost as much as Hans Rosling's Factfulness. Don't Believe a Word by David Shariat-Madari and Words on the Move by John McWhorter. Two quite extraordinary people who've distilled their expertise into entertaining and illuminating reading. McWhorter devoted an initial chapter to historical examples of what is currently happening to the English word literally. And by way of warning, the full title of his book is Words on the Move, Why English Won't and Can't Sit Still, like literally. Very, for example, is from verily, and once meant genuinely, and it is now used quite differently, having lost the meaning of its origin. The word really is on a very similar path. And despite it feeling like a very modern phenomenon, the same has been happening to literally for decades. And the explanation is rooted in a bit of linguistics that describes how these words become modal pragmatic markers, which is comically opaque language for something that reveals quite a lot about our language, how personal we make it, and how we use many words to convey attitude, emphasis, relationship, and to manage discourse. Well, so, really, very, like, and literally are essential parts of speech in this regard, but they are alien to the word types, nouns, verbs and adjectives and the rest that we teach in schools. Anyone, though, objecting to beginning a sentence with the word well should probably update their usage library. And, as luck might have it, in 2015, a heavily revised version of Fowler's Modern English Usage was published. It very much signalled that the tide had turned. Fowler's 2015 is a work of guidance founded on evidence of how we use our language, not on the opinions of how someone thinks we should use it. It's also vastly easier to read than its predecessors, and it plants Fowler's as a solid advocate of the consequences for usage of the dynamic nature of language. If there is a member of the Gestapo in your life who tuts at split infinitives, or when you say different to instead of different from, or if you were to end a sentence on a preposition, please be emboldened by the relegation of all of these by Fowler's from prescriptive rules to matters of style and preference. This has not been an example of Thought for the Day broadcasting intolerable flaws of fact and logic. The linguistic error I claim Swift made is not being made by Daniel, and Daniel does a fine job of presenting a reflection from a religious perspective. The teaching path from Shelley to stewardship versus ownership is clearly effective and no doubt well trodden. I've also no doubt that Swift landed the lessons of his sermon using his etymological construct with power and precision, regardless of the linguistics and the idiosyncrasy. Greenberg, though, is guilty of a little exaggeration. He says,
through land law, credit law and employment law, this week's Torah portion focuses the Jewish concept of property on responsibility and not on possession. I'm a guardian of any property that is sheli, allocated to me from time to time, and I must nurture it and share it in that spirit. This was a radical message in biblical times in many societies where might was right and possession was 10/10 of the law.
The suggestion, though, that this was radical is a case of overstatement. Several centuries before the Torah, the Babylonian king Hammurabi was responsible for an extensive code of civil law, known today as the Hammurabi Code. It regulated property and tenancy and debt to protect the vulnerable. Proclamations of debt release were also a feature of several Mesopotamian kingdoms that preceded the emergence of Judaism. These cancellations were, though, discretionary and political, not theological and systematic as under Judaic law. But Sumerian, Babylonian and Assyrian rulers would proclaim debt cancellations as a means to maintain social stability. To suggest that early Jews were an oasis of civilization in a world of barbarism and warlords is fanciful. Trade was vital for the success of societies in the region in these times, and effective trade required justice, rules, contracts and courts. Might is right was not the prevailing system governing property, not even close. The theological integration of debt and property law was also not new. King Hammurabi's authority was considered to be a divine gift. The explicit claim, though, that all land belonged to God was something of a rare feature in the Torah, perhaps even a unique feature. In any event, I remain grateful to Daniel Greenberg for an opportunity to explore the fluid nature of language and the endlessly evolving meanings of words. Thank you for listening to the Thought for the Day podcast. For transcripts, notes, original recordings, please visit secondthoughtfortheday.com.